That was 2 minutes. How did that make you feel just then? Bit awkward, wasn't it? And did you feel like anxious or fidgety, or were you just really annoyed? You just wasted 2 minutes of your life. But kind of like have this instinct to do something, don't we, when there are those gaps to fill the time somehow. And I know at school we call it like unstructured time, and that is when things go quite chaotic, really. So, and does anyone remember the story of the golden calf in Exodus? Okay. So in that story, Moses is on a mission. He goes up Mount Sinai, and he's there to talk with God to sort of determine the future of Israel. It's not a jolly, it's very important work. He's going to establish the covenant with God and the people. So, but the people have to wait. And the people are at the base of the mountain, and they get fed up, they get frustrated. So what do they do in that situation? They gather around Aaron, and they start to harass him, and they say to him, come on, make us a God. Make us a God that is going to get us out of this situation, that is going to guide us and protect us. And the actual words he uses are, as for this fellow Moses who brought us out of Egypt, we don't know what has happened to him. Firstly, they create this golden calf, and the people start worshipping it, and they have a right old party, and it gets probably really degenerate. And Moses comes back, and it's just really bad. They've rejected God. And I suppose ultimately the Israelites believed that their fate, that their life was in Moses' hands. They didn't really understand that it was God who brought them out of Egypt, not Moses. So, yeah, what they did was rejecting God. They felt afraid. They took control of the situation. Let's do something about this. We don't trust God ultimately. And I remember Saul and how he became king. So it's kind of like a similar theme, really. At the time, Samuel was the prophet over Israel, and he was the one who was connected to God and ensured that the people were safe because he had the relationship with God, and God protected them. But Samuel's sons were like absolute rogues, and Samuel was quite old. So the people looked at that situation and they thought, this isn't going to be good. When Samuel finally dies, his sons aren't going to look after us. So what do we need? How are we going to survive having all these enemies around us? What are we going to do? I tell you what we need. We need a king. We need a king like all these other powerful countries around us have. And that is what's going to keep us safe. So, and actually, we kind of know what we want. So we'll choose the king. So, of course, they then approach Samuel and say, right, give us a king. God says, okay, give them what they want. So they end up with Saul. So we'll skip forward a bit. Saul is now selected and anointed as king, so it's official. He's got God's blessing, but he is the king of the people's choice and not God's. So skip forward a bit. um, Samuel gives Saul an instruction. Go to Gilgal, which is a town somewhere. I'll be there in 7 days, right? When I get there, I will sort all the sacrifices and burnt offerings, but you need to wait until I get there. So skip forward a bit. Saul is waiting, not looking good. There's quite a few, the Philistines are sort of on the horizon. So starting to feel afraid, like might be in trouble here. Samuel hasn't turned up. 7 days have passed, and the Philistines are starting to close in on him a bit. The people that he's with are seeing that as well. So they start to panic, and then they start to scatter away from him. So, and also, Israel have got absolutely no weapons whatsoever. So it's a bit like Israel are like Dad's army, if you remember that. Only Saul and his son have a sword. So, I mean, you can kind of understand that he's going to feel afraid and that he's going to want to do something, but the instruction was to wait. And the waiting was like testing, really. Did he trust God? Was he prepared to wait and trust that God would do something? So, what happens? Well, he just cracks on with the sacrifices. And of course, Samuel does turn up in time, and he sees what's happened, and he's annoyed about it because he's like, oh, why didn't you wait? Why didn't you wait? And so Saul's answer to that is, let me find that. I don't know. Yeah, so waiting often reveals how much we trust in God. So Saul thought in that situation that he knew best, and that the best thing was to sacrifice now. He thought that sacrifice is a magic button that he can press to make God act and to save him from this enemy. Waiting in that situation would have been obedience, which is pleasing to God. And Samuel says later on in Samuel 15, to obey is better than to sacrifice. Anyway, yeah, when he rocks up, Samuel, he says to Saul, you have acted foolishly. And like, I mean, you don't want to hear those words from anyone, but not from Samuel. Like, it just must have been devastating. So Saul says, I have not sought the Lord's favor, so I felt compelled to offer the sacrifice. So it's almost like he tries to spiritualize it. He says like, oh, well, in that situation, he realized that he hadn't prayed to God, so he thought he'd better do it. But it's kind of spiritualizing disobedience in a way, if that makes sense. Anyway, Samuel ultimately says to him that if you'd been obedient, like, God would have established your throne forever. But because you weren't, that's it, game over. And that was it. I mean, that was the day when it ended for Saul. Even though the story plays out more, it was that disobedience, that lack of trust that displeased God. So now David comes onto the scene. David was going to be the next king of Israel. He was going to be the king that God chooses and God was going to choose a king based on that person's heart and not based on what they look like or how they appear. And he gives that instruction to Samuel, John, when David is I won't go into the story, but he says to Samuel, don't look at the appearance. I'll tell you who to pick. I, God, see the heart, and I will tell you the one. So David is the king that Israel have been waiting for. Even though they didn't know it, they didn't realize it, they thought they knew what was best. But David was God's man because God chose him, God saw his heart, and that his heart was the Torah, the God's law, God's commands were written on his heart, which is why God chose him. But having said all that, it was complicated. So Saul's kind of still the king at this point, and David's been anointed by Samuel. But it all had to be done in secret, obviously, because Saul wouldn't have been happy. So, I mean, at that point, I'm not sure if David knows that he's the king, because it just says, well, he was anointed. But then it must have seemed weird that Samuel just appeared and did this kind of ceremony. But I don't know. But anyway, the anointing is like God's blessing on him. God putting his spirit into David. Anyway, so Saul is struggling. Still the king, struggling. Got a few anger issues. And yeah, struggling to sleep at night, just feeling angry. And he thinks, right, well, or maybe someone suggests to him, what you need is some music. That'll calm you down. We know this really decent musician. Why don't you sort of try that, see if it helps? So in comes David. And actually, when David starts playing music to him, it's really soothing. And Saul finds that whenever he's in David's presence, he feels all right. And actually, he really likes David. But the problem is, so do most of Israel as well. So, David then, not through his own doing, just through an opportunity that's given to him, ends up in the royal court. And he ends up like getting all this favor from God and success. And of course, Saul doesn't like that. Starts to get more and more paranoid. He's convinced that David is out to take his throne. And really, to be fair, he is going to get the throne, but not in the way that Saul thinks. So from there, we have like a game of like cat and mouse where, yeah, essentially Saul wants to kill him and he's chasing him all around Israel to try and do that. And David just got to wait. David, he must at some point know that something special's happened. He's going to be the king. He must slowly realize that, but he's got to wait. And it's quite an amusing story where 1 Samuel 24, where it says in the Bible, Saul was relieving himself in a cave. I Googled like Saul. Well, it's important that you put the king bit. If you put King Saul weeing in a cave, but yeah, essentially like this, Saul was, while he was doing that, David and his men were at the back of the cave, and David sort of sneaks up on him and just like trims the corner of his garment off. And afterwards, he sort of approaches Saul and says like, well, no, hang on, sorry. Before that, David's men say to him, you could have had him there. God has given you an opportunity. You should be king. You know you should be king. God has given you an opportunity there to bump him off, job done, and none of this running around being chased all the time. But they, and that is spiritualizing again, right? God has given you this opportunity. But David says, no. This is the Lord's anointed person. This is the Lord's anointed. He will bring about what he needs to bring about. I'm not going to try and make things happen. So yeah, it's a test. And David resists that temptation. For him, it is God who will decide and judge. God is the one to bring justice. And at that point, like, even Saul just acknowledges, like, David, look, you're going to be king. I'm an idiot. Sorry. I repent. Please forgive me. But the thing is, he doesn't really. He's up to it again. A couple of chapters later, chasing him around, trying to kill him. And again, David lets him off the hook in exactly the same way. So it was relentless. Apparently it lasted about 15 years, that. From the time he was anointed to the time he actually became king was like 15 years of running around in the desert trying to avoid being killed. And there's so many stories about David, it's like fantastic victories, just like showing his heart for God. But there's also like massive failure and tragedy. His family was so dysfunctional in the end. He was just a human like the rest of us, really. But yeah, what shines through is his character and his heart. And even when he messed up, he was prepared to just humble himself and before God, and just to be real, not to hide. And I think that's why I love the Psalms, really. I think the Psalms are like a window into that heart. And they show us what a right heart to God looks like. And they give us permission to be honest about where we're at, to be raw with God when we're angry and when we're broken. And ultimately, like, they just encourage us to trust in God. So that's why I wanted to talk about Psalm 31 for today, even though I've not really talked about it. But that psalm was written in a context. It was written it was a real person's life. And it was someone who never gave up on crying out to God. So I think, have you got a photo there, Steve? So that is like in our house, and that's part of Psalm 31. I think that's, yeah. But I trusted in, I'll say it in that version, because actually it was my dad who gave me that. And he talks like in that kind of language, kind of. But I trusted in thee, O Lord. I said, thou art my God. My times are in thy hand. And yeah, I think I was in a time of real struggle then. I went to my dad and started crying out to him, really. Felt surrounded and just absolutely helpless. In the Bible, it calls it like a narrow place. Like there's no room. There's no wiggle room. You've got no options. And my dad gave me that verse. And that's why it's written there. Because I thought, there's a lot of times someone gives you a verse, it can be annoying. But actually, when he gave me that verse, I thought, do you know what? That is foundational. That is what it's all about. So in the psalm, you just really need to read that psalm. I'm sorry, I haven't got time to do it today, but he says, you are my rock and my fortress. For your name's sake, you lead and guide me. He knows that God is a foundation, a rock, something, someone actually, that you can build your life on. Solid, reliable, trustworthy. When everything looks like a mess, and the world looks like quite a lot of a mess, to be honest with you, at the minute. But we know that we are on solid ground. And he also says in the psalm, you have set my feet in a broad place. And I just love that idea. I mean, that makes me think of like standing on top of a hill somewhere and just being able to breathe and just freedom to just move. And that's what God will do. Even when we're in a narrow spot, ultimately, he will move you to a broad place. He will bless you if you trust in him. You have done it, Lord, and he did it for me. Even when I thought I was surrounded, I was stuck, jammed in, he brought me to a broad place. Be gracious to me, Lord. I'm in distress. My eyes are wasted from grief. My soul, my body, everything. I can't sleep. I can hear people whispering all sorts of things about me, and they're scheming and they want to take my life. Look at me, Lord, I'm broken. I've got nothing. I've got absolutely nothing. The whole world, it feels like the whole world is against me. But I trust in you, God. I trust in you. You're my God. My life is in your hands. So David, Israel, often struggled with trust, and the relationship with God was rocky. But despite that, God showed them great mercy, and he remained faithful to them. He never cast them off as his people. He remained faithful, and he kept his promises. And he made a promise to David, and that promise was that a descendant of yours will be on the throne for all time, and that I, God, will establish his kingdom. And ever since that promise was made, a lot happened. A lot. Israel lost their land. They got taken over by all sorts of other countries that surrounded them. They just oppressed them, took their stuff. The temple was destroyed. And they were they're ruled by other nations. But in all of that, there was always a hope that someday the Messiah would come. And the Messiah, they thought, would be like David. He would be kind of military hero, I suppose. He'd come along and throw the Romans out and just win all the battles for them. And lead them in righteousness. And they waited. And they waited. And they waited. And the irony is that while they waited, he actually came. And he came not just to free them from the Romans and lead them in righteousness, but to free them from themselves, from their own brokenness, from all those destructive patterns in our lives and the chaos. Came to free them and us from that. That's true freedom. And there was absolutely no flaw in him. David was a flawed character. There was no flaw in the Messiah, the true Messiah. He was perfect because he was God. Before Jesus came along, no one had seen God. But now people were actually looking at God in the face, fully human and fully God, from the line of David, as promised. And that offended the religious establishment. They hated that. They hated it. So they tortured him to death. What can we do with this king who is anointed by God, this anointed Son of God, who has come with the authority of God, who is shown through all his actions that he is God, through miracles, through all sorts. What can we do to get rid of this guy? Well, let's nail him to a cross. Let's torture him. He was the one that they tortured. He was the one that wore the crown, that spilled his blood. But what they didn't know was that they were just fulfilling God's plan, and that this perfect sacrifice, the spotless lamb, God's own son, that sacrifice was for us to reconnect us to God. It was the only way that we could become God's people. Yeah, because we were separated. Everyone, we're all separated from God. But from birth we are, and our lives are messy, and there's no way we can be reunited for him in our own strength. So God made a way, and he did it through Jesus. And everyone who looks to Jesus and says, I trust you, you're my God, I put my life in your hands. Everyone who does that will be restored. The relationship with God is restored. They become righteous. You and me, we become righteous and acceptable before God, not because of the lives that we live, but because of Jesus, because of his sacrifice on the cross. And God's shown us what love is. And he's brought us into his family. And he's actually called us children of God. And he wants to be with us now in this life, to be close to us. So the relationship that David had with God, you can have because of Jesus. And it's not just in this life, it's for eternity, because it didn't stop at the cross. On the third day, he rose again and defeated death. He showed that he has the power over death. He is God. And yeah, we will be with him. We're with him now, and we will be with him. And his kingdom will endure forever. And we will be with him in that kingdom. Okay, thank you for listening. I appreciate that.